Would you like to be somebody who understands how insecurity and egos perpetuate suffering? Then listen to this entire video where I explain the background behind suffering, why it exists, and how insecurities and egos actually just make it stronger or make it harder to transcend suffering. So before we get into this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to learn more about self-development, dating, and how to reduce suffering in life. Let's get into it. Now, there's a famous quote that says, hurt people hurt people. What this means is people who have been damaged or who have experienced a lot of suffering tend to hurt other people and actually perpetuate suffering, and that is what I will be building on today. So let me explain how emotional wounds and insecurities can end up producing suffering. So we all suffer. It's like an inherent aspect in life. Whether you get ill, some disease, you can get cancer, maybe a relative of yours dies, or you get hit by a car. It's bound to happen to a degree, and we really can't escape it. And these are common occurrences. One might start to think that life is like a bad joke because suffering is such an enormous aspect of it. Like, you'd think, who the hell came up with this game? And this can result in, depressive, nihilistic tendencies, whether you start to believe, when you start to believe that there is no meaning in life and that life is just suffering and it's like despicable. In my last video, I discussed the utility of suffering and how valuable it can be because without struggle, there is no progress. They come hand in hand. And suffering is the cornerstone of growth. Of course, there are different degrees of suffering, but in general, you cannot transform in life without going through difficulties in life beforehand. And seeking discomfort, like going into, like voluntarily or involuntarily, going through struggles it's the foundation of growth. Seeking discomfort equals growth. And this perspective would seem bulletproof, that suffering is necessary, if it weren't for the cases where people never transcend and grow from their suffering. You may know people that never overcame their difficulties and actually sort of drowned, metaphorically speaking, in their suffering instead. And I've seen these cases, and they're quite common, I believe, actually, like where people have just been consumed by their difficulties and by the suffering they have experienced and never seem to overcome it. And this issue, this idea has troubled me for quite a few months now because I just couldn't understand why suffering existed. I eventually figured out that it was necessary, like I just explained, in order to progress in life, so it has utility. And you need two extremes in life for there to be a dimension. So well-being on the one hand and suffering on the other. You need to pull them apart, and then you have dimension in between. And if you only have one of them, like well-being or suffering, you have a one-dimensional sort of space, and then nothing can exist in it because it's only one-dimensional. You need two dimensions. And yeah, so there is a saying that, or sort of teachings that, you wouldn't know the value of sunshine if it wasn't for rain, and you wouldn't know the value of well-being and absence of suffering if you hadn't experienced suffering before, because the opposites give each other value, give each other context. Yeah. So I concluded, okay, so there is value in suffering, but not always, I think. And this is why the perspective that suffering is always valuable doesn't work, because as I said, there are countless people that dwell in their suffering for the rest of their lives, and they get depressed, commit suicide, or hide in their house and get addicted to drugs, alcohol, or sort of eating disorder, or they adopt eating disorders. Like, these people never transcend their suffering. They're totally overwhelmed by it and just can't sort of deal with it. And this is really troubling, actually. And I just couldn't understand why some people couldn't transcend their suffering and others could. It seemed sort of unfair to me. And of course, life isn't fair, because we all suffer. But I couldn't wrap my head around it. But I think I have figured it out now, and this is my reason. Or a bit to describe it. So those people who never transcend their suffering those people who never transcended their suffering didn't have access and were subjected to certain things that these people who probably did transcend their suffering didn't have, or had different situations, and yeah. And they didn't have, so these people who didn't transcend it didn't have possess the right tools to transcend it. And one of these tools is a support system. Perhaps they didn't have family and friends around them that could keep their morals high and keep them persisting through the struggle. And I can explain from my own experience how my network, my family, my friends have given me so much value during times of despair and times of struggle in my life. And like, seriously, without them, I would for real not be who I am today, and I quite enjoy who I am today. And it would have been way harder to persist through my own suffering. Straight up, it's an entire game changer. And if these people didn't have access to these loving communities, these loving families, like your ability to transcend the suffering is dramatically diminished, I think. Secondly, in order to transcend pain, you need to have some sort of robustness and faith within your soul. Now, what I mean is, if you have been severely hurt or inflicted pain upon in your past, you are likely to have sort of wounds in your soul, making your soul less robust. Unless you transcend the pain and your soul has consequently become stronger and actually more robust than it was before, because it has a stronger armor and is more resilient, let's say. And because there are different levels of suffering, like hitting your toe against a chair is not the same as getting cancer, it is harder to heal some wounds more than others. So you have people who have experienced unthinkable, horrific circumstances, and the average community, I think there is this sort of like a human capacity to deal with suffering, and it is limited, though it's quite big, the capacity, but I do think it has its limit, and the average human capacity to experience suffering is quite high, but some situations are so threatening to the human capacity that I'm not certain people can take it. An example would be experiencing evil, for example, people who underwent time in the sort of Nazi concentration camps or gulags in the Soviet Union. The circumstances are so horrific. It's understandable how people would not transcend that, because it is just it's so evil. In its realist sense, it is evil. And you get people like the inmates in these concentration camps, I'm sure, have wounds in their soul, had wounds, and may have never been able to transcend it because it was just so terrible and so horrific. And if there is a wound, there is some sort of insecurity, I think, which cannot persist through suffering as well, because the armor of the human is already battered. Like, let's say you were molested as a kid. You may have developed this insecurity that you're not valuable enough, because otherwise your parents wouldn't have molested you, because if you were valuable, your parents would have taken care of you, and you have this wound, this insecurity inside of you. And if there is this insecurity, your sort of soul isn't robust, and the armor to defend against suffering is already sort of predetermined in that it is weak. And hence the suffering is absorbed and the person collapses in their hope and their faith that there is beauty and meaning in life, and they simply become nihilistic, I think, because they still have this, when their weak armor cracks then and the suffering caves in, it wallops them. They just can't handle it, I think. Yeah. And then we're just back at where we started. You despise your own existence. You just adopt destructive behavior because you don't care. Why would you care to behave morally and nobly in a world where there is no benefit for you, because all you do is just suffer? And in conclusion, you perpetuate your own suffering with your destructive behavior, and you perpetuate the suffering of the people around you because they are connected to you and your behavior has an influence on them. And one can also relate this to egos, because egos protect insecurities and they build this arrogance. Like, if you have an ego, you can build this arrogance and this delusion within yourself in order to avoid this insecurity from revealing itself and being hit. So you build up this ego, this armor. And because that would be, well, you build up this ego because trying to understand the root of your insecurity is quite painful. And this is like, it's essentially instant gratification versus delayed gratification, because you don't want to undergo the painful confrontation of your insecurity now for a benefit later. You'd rather just continue with the reasonably okay situation where you have the insecurity, but you have this ego which sort of protects it. And you start lying to yourself, and then you start living a lie which is dangerously pathological, because you build this arrogance and this ego, this image, and which might not really be you. And you might start to live a lie which really isn't about who you are, and that's pathological because it is essentially a lie. And seriously, if you lie to yourself, you corrupt your ability to truthfully interpret reality in the world. And if you keep doing this as time goes along, you sink into this confusion, and your ability to decipher what is real and what is fake will be so far gone that it's very tricky to get back, and it will absolutely ruin your life. I've seen it been done in parts of my family, and I can tell you, it is horrific to see. Absolutely horrific. And the hope to sort of help these people get back their ability to truthfully interpret reality is just... It seems like there is no hope at times, really. It's horrible. So please don't lie. Please, it's the cornerstone of suffering. It really is. Hence, in conclusion, if we wrap this video up, insecurities perpetuate suffering because you already have like a volatile and unstable soul with a weak armor, that when there is additional suffering, your life caves in, and the suffering caves in, and then the additional suffering wallops you, and you adopt then this destructive behavior, and you build these egos and this sort of fake armor, which helps you lie to yourself and make this fake image, and which doesn't reflect who you really are, and you live this lie which will create enough suffering for you in itself. But it's the key is here that people who are insecure, which most people are, including myself, already have a damaged soul, and your ability to deflect the suffering and transcend it goes down because you are already damaged and weak. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this long video. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to learn more about self-development, dating, and how to reduce suffering in life. That was it. Thank you for listening.